Hello everyone. Today I will be featuring my first impressions of an upcoming new premium that is actually quite interesting. It's the Key, the Tier 8 upcoming IJN Battleship Premium. Now it's a work in progress, and some of the things that show in the stats right now I already know that aren't final. Like, some of these things are going to change and I'll mention them as I get to them. But I'll start by covering the basics of this ship. Now, the obvious comparison ship for this Key is obviously the Amagi, since they are very similar, but still quite different. But very similar design, very similar looks as well. Obviously, first things first, health pool 68.2, slightly more than the Amagi's 66.3, and overall a pretty good health pool for a Tier 8 battleship. Now, the first thing you probably notice when comparing this is, of course, that the Key does not have the amazing torpedo belt of the Amagi. In fact, does it have the same as the NC's? No, it has slightly more than the NC's torp belt, but let's say 27% isn't much of a torpedo belt for a battleship. So nothing compared to Amagi's 45%. So Amagi retains that special thing, whereas Key does not get it. Another thing worth noting is that the armor is significantly worse on the Key. Now, at first glance you might look at the armor and go, wow, 292 broadside armor? The Amagi only gets 254. That must mean that it's tankier than the Amagi. Well, that's very misleading, because that's not actually the case. Because, well, first of all, let's start off with the front. Overmatches are a thing because of the Yamato, and in general you can get some funky citadels if someone punches through this side here and hits your citadel. Well, on the Amagi this is very difficult to achieve, because as you can see, the front here is 229mm and even the underwater one is 152. On the Key, on the other hand, well, the citadel is further back, deeper in the ship, so to say, but it's only 73mm of armor. Another thing worth noting is that if you do get to punch through this broadside, 292 versus 254, well, if you do it on the Amagi, you still have to get past 102 or 95mm of armor. You have to get past this, or if you're talking plunging fire, then you have to get past this 70mm or 114. So there's still like a second layer of armor protecting it if you get past that first layer. Whereas on the Key, on the other hand, let's get rid of some of this garbage. We have a 38mm armor, 22 and 63. Okay, this one is somewhat decent, but this broadside, especially being only 38mm, kinda negates all the advantages that you gained from having this additional broadside armor. And I've noted that it's very easy to get citadeled in this thing at range. The Amagi has, of course, the notorious weakness/strength of being able to be citadeled at range, but close range, the turtleback makes it practically invulnerable. I don't know if the same thing really applies to the Key, because, well, it's such a thin turtleback, or, well, such a thin layer of armor here that's actually protecting it. It might be that this layer of turtleback is enough to protect it, maybe not. I think maybe an Amagi at close range might be able to hit you, because you got a waterline citadel just like the Amagi does, so it's not outside the realm of possibility that you might be able to get citadel at close range. Hopefully someone will test that and find out. But what I have noticed is that at long range, you can absolutely get citadel quite easily through this. The plunging fire, which is a problem for the Amagi, is an even bigger problem for the Key because of this significantly thinner armor. So that's obviously a weakness and an advantage in favor of the Amagi. So the Amagi has both the torpedo belt and the armor in its favor. Now, that doesn't mean that, of course, it's all bad though. And as I said, I quite like the Key. Alright, so now that we've covered the armor, let's move on to the guns. Now, there are some significant changes to be coming for these guns. At first glance, once again, 35-second reload. Well, this is already something that's going to change. It's not going to have a 35-second reload in the final version. In fact, in the next patch, they will be buffing this reload from 35 to 31 seconds. They will also be buffing the turtleverse, which is very slow, 54.5 seconds. This is much slower than the Amagi's 41 or 42, something like that. So they're going to be buffing both the turtleverse, the reload, and they will be buffing the range from 8.7 to 9.4 km. 19.4 km, sorry, which is something that it needs. The Amagi will still retain a 500 meter range advantage, but the key will kind of catch up a bit. Secondaries, we got what, 16 HE, 5.3 km, and oh, these are AP. That's of course a downside. What about the Amagi? We got 16 AP and 16 HE, so of course the Amagi seems to win this battle, although you do have a bit more range. 8% fire chance. 8% fire chance, really? Oh, and the shell velocity is much better. So the secondaries on the key are actually better in this case. A fair amount better, in fact. But the Amagi has significantly more AP secondaries. But then again, AP secondaries aren't really much to brag about, because most of the time they tend to bounce on whatever you hit. So once again, we're kind of still in, everything seems to be going in the Amagi's favor so far. Fire chance, 30%, key, fire chance, 30%. Once again, no big differences here. Shell velocity is almost similar. So far, everything kind of is in the Amagi's favor. However, then we get to something interesting. Torpedo tubes. And that's goddamn right. There are torps on this key. They are located quite far back in the ship. In fact, if we, let's, oh, come on, there we go. I can show you just how far back. They're located right behind the back turrets. Now this actually makes it surprisingly hard to be to use these, or well, it makes it different. I noted that I tended to use my torpedoes too early, and that's because I'm used to using torpedo torps. But torpedo torps are actually located pretty far in the front, well, in the middle of the ship, so to say. And it's actually a pretty big difference between torps located here in the middle of the ship and torps located far back on the ship, as it tended to give my targets more time to react than I expected. And I learned that you kind of have to save them until the very last moment. The firing angles are very good, as actually let me show you some examples of these torpedoes in usage. Now, starting off with the guns, of course. The guns are very much like Amagi guns, and that is pretty damn consistent. I've had no real issues with them. I mean, you'd have to deal with the slower turret traverse for now, or significantly slower, and of course the significantly longer reload time. But other than that, they have behaved very much like the Amagi guns, in the sense that they are very consistent. The caliber is large enough that you can pretty much citadel anything. I've citadel Izumas, Amagis, whatever, without any issues. So these are strong guns, and not to be underestimated. And that's of course something that I value quite heavily when it comes to battleships. You know why I really like some ships that have strong guns, and why I really hate others that have weak guns. It's the guns have to feel rewarding. If I aim correctly and I predict my target's moves correctly, I want to be rewarded, and the key is quite good at that, and that's of course a plus in its favor. The fact, of course, that it also has 410mm guns means that any tier 7 or similarly armored battleship that tries to rush you can quite easily be overmatched through its nose. Well, because you have no issues with that armor, you just punch straight through it. That's how the overmatch mechanic works. For example, here we have one of the newer ones, the King George. Yes, he might have an underwater citadel and all these things, but trying to rush me because of with these caliber guns is not very advisable, because, well, I keep shooting for his nose. I don't try to go for his broadside armor, which can quite easily tank my shells. I keep aiming for his nose and relying on the overmatch mechanic, and as you can see, the guns are very reliable. However, the torps, this was one of the first times I played this ship, and when I learned just how, like, he's very close, and he's turning to the right, so I think it's safe to launch my torps. But because of how far back these torps are launched, it actually takes surprisingly long for these torpedoes to actually reach the target, and they kind of come at a very steep angle, which makes it surprisingly easy to dodge these torps. So I'm quite caught off guard here when I realize, hey, what the hell, none of my torps actually landed, and he was able to dodge this easily. Luckily, of course, the guns are fantastic, and I have no issues finishing off with the guns, but it was a good lesson to learn quite early on. Now, naturally, I took this lesson to heart, and in the future, whenever I wanted to use my torpedoes, I made sure I pretty much YOLO rushed them all, like, as close as I possibly could, and basically relied on my turtleback to make sure I couldn't get citadeled. Example here, NC, who's rushing nose in, using his superior turret positioning to fight me, but I let him come pretty much point blank before I do launch my torpedoes, and in this way I make sure that I land all 3 hits on him. Now, worth noting is that while these torpedoes do more damage than Tirpitz ones, Tirpitz are 13.7, these ones do 14.6. So that's a 900 damage advantage per torp, but very important is that the Tirpitz has 4 torpedoes, whereas the Key only has 3. So that naturally means that Tirpitz torpedoes are still significantly more scary than the Key ones, but in situations like these, they are a very handy tool, because you can of course not overmatch tier 8 and above battleship noses the same way you could to lower tier 1s. Now, another advantage that goes heavily in the Key's favor is the anti-air. Now, I will mention I'm currently running the AA module. I just slotted it for the sake of showing you guys a training room example of this AA in action, just to show you how damn strong it is. But the Amagi's AA at long range, this is 81. Is this with the AA flag? Now let's put the AA flag on for the sake of the comparison here. So the AA flag on the long range we got 89 DPS, and the mid range we got about what 210, 240, 250-ish mid range, and 89 long range. On the Key, on the other hand, we're talking 183 long range. Do I have the flag on? Yeah, I do. Okay, this is normally 5 km. It's 6 because I'm running the module. So you got 183 here, which is more than twice what you had on that one. And the mid range is not only is it longer range, it's 3.7 on this. I think were these 3. These are 3.1. So not only is it longer range, but you got 194 on the mid range, but you also got a short range aura, which is the same 3.1 but 114. This of course means that especially these guns, because they are 100mm guns, these guns benefit extremely well from manual AA. Manual AA of course doubles the DPS of any AA guns above 100. So for the sake of the comparison, I will now show you a training room test against some bots, just to show you how much potential this anti-air has, should you spec for it. In this case, I'll run a captain that runs, actually let me show you the captain. I just made a new captain. Where did I put him? Just made a new captain for this, goddammit. There he is. Alright, so this captain has BFT, AFT and manual AA. So probably more AA than you would usually go, but then again, if you plan on playing this with a carrier body or something, this is of course interesting to see. Now you can see the values with this captain on: 220 7.2 km range, 232 5.1 km range, and 137 4.4 km range. So obviously this kind of captain can compete with the North Carolina in sheer AA denial, because the long range DPS is pretty damn scary. Is this AFT captain? Yeah, this is AFT captain, and this is AA range captain as well. So you can see just how well it can compete with the values of the NC. It doesn't quite reach it doesn't have the mid range DPS of the NC, but the long range 151. This is of course without BFT though, and 220. So we are very much starting to compete with the NC territory when it comes to anti-air on this ship. Anyway, let's move on to my promised test. Right, in order to make this test feel a bit more accurate, I have tier 9 carriers, the Taiho, because bots tend to use stock planes. So by putting in tier 9 carriers, it kind of simulates tier 8 planes. So this is basically what it would be. This is like a slightly better version of the Shokaku that we're facing. It's a Shokaku with more planes. And since bots tend to space out their attacks, whereas actual humans tend to strike at the same time, I added 3 of them to give a better comparison. So this is probably a harder version of what you might actually face if a Shokaku tried to strike you. This is a harder version to deal with, so to say, considering there's significantly more squads coming your way, but of course not as well controlled as a human squad would be. Alright, let's check A values. Looking good. Here comes the first planes. It's 5.1, all of that mid-range. This is of course the manual AA. that was some good RNG sniping down the squad instantly. Let's see if it keeps it up. Yeah, when he gets within the mid-range, they start dropping very quickly. Yeah, these squads drop quite quickly. These are of course the interesting one, the torpedo planes. Turning into them as I probably would against the human. As you can quite easily see from this though, there's no way a Shokaku is gonna be striking you. There's no way a Shokaku is, or a Lexington or anything of that tier is gonna get away with striking you. I didn't actually lose, I did lose a bit of mid-range from all those bombs, but in general against triple Taiho I really had no issues surviving the strike and dealing with it. Even though I can't say I even dodged or managed the AA perfectly, it still just shows you how incredibly powerful this anti-air, especially if you spec for it. Even if you don't spec for it, the AA will be very, very strong. So that's of course always a nice thing to have on a battleship. So this is one of course compensating for the weaknesses or the advantages the Amagi had. This ship clearly has advantages of its own. Maneuverability wise, these ships are very, very similar. Ki does 29.5, Amagi does 30. Is this with the flags? Let's check flag. No flags are on. So 5 knot advantage, or 0.5, not 5, 0.5 knot advantage for the Amagi. 880 turning circle versus 870 for the Amagi, but in return the Ki turns like has a 1.4 seconds faster rudder shift. So very small differences here. They handle extremely similarly. Concealment wise, the Amagi does have a small advantage, 15.1 without captain. That's with module and camo, 15.6 without captain for the Ki. So the Ki can reach 13.4 km concealment with the full stealth build. Not amazing, but really not bad either. Overall though, my initial impression of this ship is pretty positive. I like the idea. The AA, while it's strong if you spec for it, if you don't fully spec for it, I mean, it's still potent, but I mean, it's not, I don't think it's going to be that game breaking. Of course, I kind of dislike the whole AA power creep maybe a bit. But especially on battleships, since I kind of feel like this is more of a cruiser role that's doesn't need to be happening too much, or this is more of a cruiser feature, and the more you buff this thing on battleships, the less relevant cruisers of course become. But against higher tier carriers, it's not like the Ki will get away with surviving any sort of strikes. Of course, higher tier carriers are a different matter. Although, if you do run a full AA build, then you might have something to say about higher tier carriers as well. Overall though, I actually quite like, my initial impressions of this ship are quite positive. It has a clear set of weaknesses compared to the Amagi. It doesn't have the same torpedo belt, it doesn't have the same armor, but it does have its advantages. Torpedoes and AA in return, and of course not the same concealment, slightly worse guns. It's a series of trade-offs, and that's the way I kind of like my premiums. If they are inherently superbly strong, then I don't really see much value in them. When it comes to random battles, it's gonna be pretty close which one is better. The Amagi, thanks to its armor, might still be better. When it comes to competitive though, the Ki might have a position to compete with the Amagi, especially in very close quarters maps, like let's say Trident or something like that. pushing in or charging in with the key becomes a significantly bigger threat thanks to the torpedoes, and of course you require less carrier babysitting with the key in a competitive battle, because usually a carrier kind of has to look out for the friendly Amagi so that the Amagi doesn't get sniped by the carrier, but in a competitive setting you might not need that carrier babysitting the same way because you have such strong anti-air, so it might free up some carrier resources elsewhere, and I quite like that idea. I like the trade-off. It should be quite interesting to see. In return though, if you do get struck by a carrier, of course, you do take more damage in the key because you have a significantly weaker torpedo belt. So once again, it's a series of trade-offs. But my first impressions of this key is positive. Especially, well, the pre-buff version, the one with the slow guns, it still feels pretty okay, to be honest. I didn't think it was that bad. But obviously the ship is going to be a lot stronger once they buff the guns, since they're buffing so many parameters of the guns, especially the reload, which will be a significant DPM buff. So I am looking forward to this ship, but once again, it's a work in progress and there's still a lot of things probably that might change, so I can't really give any sort of recommendation / don't buy it comment, since it's subject to change. I will of course return to it if we do get to test it in its final form before it's released. We don't, us CCs don't always get to test these ships in the final form. Sometimes they get changed right before they get released, and then pretty much all our commentaries are outdated. So let's hope it doesn't happen this time and I actually get to cover this key before it's released, and I can give my final verdict. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.